imagine for a moment that you are a highly trained cardiac surgeon.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right, so you've got a patient on the operating table, and things have just gone completely wrong.
Oh, no.
Yeah, their heart has stopped. They are, by every modern medical metric, clinically dead. So you step back from the table to give the resuscitation team room to work.
Which is standard procedure, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But you've just scrubbed in. So to keep your hands sterile, you point out instructions to your team using your elbows.
Which means you're basically flapping your arms up and down.
Right, like a chicken. So hours later, against all odds, your patient is stabilized. They wake up in recovery. You go in to check on them, and the very first thing they say to you is, "Doctor, when I was dead, why were you flapping your wings?"
Wow. I mean, that just gives you chills.
Right. How does a brain with literally zero electrical activity in a body with its eyes taped shut see you from the ceiling?
This is wild.
It really is. And that right there is our mission for this deep dive.
It's a scenario that just completely shatters our traditional understanding of biology and, consciousness itself.
Totally.
Because we are so used to this idea that the mind is entirely dependent on the physical brain, right? So stories like The Flapping Surgeon, they force us to ask some really uncomfortable questions.
Yeah, they do. And just to be incredibly clear right up front for you listening, we are not here today to validate any specific religious doctrine.
Right. Absolutely not.
We aren't here to preach or, to tell you definitively what happens to your soul after you die. We're just here to look at a massive, incredibly compelling body of data.
And we really are remaining completely neutral here. We're just reporting what the sources say.
Exactly. We are going to synthesize a giant stack of medical journals, historical philosophical texts, and peer-reviewed psychiatric research to explore this profound human phenomenon, one that just fundamentally alters how people live.
And it is quite a dense stack of material we have in front of us today.
Oh yeah, it's a lot.
Our foundational text is this groundbreaking 1975 book by Dr. Raymond Moody. It's called Life After Life.
A classic.
Yeah. We are specifically looking at its Italian edition structure alongside a really highly critical review of his initial work that was published in the Journal of Scientific Exploration.
Right, we've got the critics in here too.
Exactly. We also have a detailed executive summary of his findings. And then, to ground all of this in a broader context, we're pulling from a fascinating historical chapter from Cambridge University Press.
Which blew my mind, by the way.
Same here. And finally, we have a deeply comprehensive 2015 peer-reviewed paper authored by Dr. Bruce Grayson from the academic journal Humanities.
Okay, well, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because if we really want to understand how a clinically dead patient can see their doctor doing a chicken dance, we have to start with the man who essentially mapped this whole territory.
Yes.
Dr. Raymond Moody.
Yes. And what's so interesting about him is his background. I mean, he wasn't actually a medical doctor initially.
Right, really? I always assumed he was a cardiologist or something.
Wait, no, actually. He started his academic career as professor of philosophy and logic.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so he was trained to look at the structure of arguments, the nature of human belief, epistemology, basically how we know what we know.
Right, so he's coming at it from a completely different angle.
Exactly. But during his time in academia, he kept running into students and acquaintances who would tell him these wildly consistent, just deeply personal stories about what happened to them when they were revived from clinical death.
Well, because he's a philosopher, he doesn't just, dismiss them as crazy.
No, not at all. He sees a pattern.
An undeniable pattern.
Yeah. It intrigued him to such a degree that he made a massive pivot in his life. He actually decided to go to medical school.
Just to study this.
Yep. He eventually became a psychiatrist, specifically so he could have the clinical vocabulary and the authority to study this phenomenon formally.
That is dedication.
It really is. So in 1975, after interviewing roughly 150 individuals who had been resuscitated from clinical death, he published his findings, and he officially coined the term near-death experience, or NDE.
I have to admit, when I was looking through the timeline of all this, the year 1975 really jumped out at me.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because the timing isn't just a random coincidence, is it? It feels incredibly tied to what was happening in medicine at that exact moment.
You've hit on the exact catalyst for why this entire field even exists.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Well, for the vast, overwhelming majority of human history, the line between life and death was incredibly rigid. I mean, if your heart stopped beating and your lungs stopped drawing in air, that was it. That was the end of your story.
Right, you were dead. There was no coming back. It was a one-way street.
Exactly. But then, in the 1960s and early 1970s, we saw these momentous, world-changing breakthroughs in medical technology.
Like what, specifically?
Specifically, the development and widespread adoption of cardiopulmonary resuscitation, CPR.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, CPR and external defibrillation. Suddenly, medical science had the protocols to literally pull people back from the absolute brink.
So because of CPR, we accidentally created this entirely new demographic of people.
That's exactly it. We inadvertently manufactured a massive modern data set for a very ancient phenomenon.
That is wild to think about.
For the first time in human history, we had tens of thousands of people surviving clinical death and returning to talk about it. So Moody's work in 1975, it was simply the match that lit the fuse.
It woke the modern world up to what this newly formed population was collectively experiencing.
Exactly.
So let's get into the actual anatomy of this phenomenon, like what actually happens during an NDE, because pop culture has given us all a very specific, almost Hollywood version of this, right?
Yeah, Morgan Freeman and some fluffy clouds, usually.
Exactly. But in the source material, Moody identified a very rigid, specific sequence, didn't he?
He did. In his original analysis, Moody identified 15 distinct, common elements that just appeared repeatedly across the 150 accounts he gathered.
15 is a lot of overlap.
It is, but science requires rigorous categorization, right? So decades later, Dr. Bruce Grayson, who is widely considered one of the leading psychiatric researchers in this specific field, he took Moody's foundational observations and subjected them to modern statistical analysis.
Okay, so he stress-tested the data. Did Moody's 15 elements actually hold up under the math?
They did, yeah. But Grayson organized them much more effectively. He developed what's known as the Grayson NDE scale.
The Grayson scale. Got it.
Yeah, and this scale classifies these features into 4 distinct categories: cognitive, affective, paranormal, and transcendental.
Okay, let's break those down. What's the cognitive category?
The cognitive category deals with changes in thought processes. So things like time distortion or suddenly having a sense of universal understanding.
Like suddenly knowing how the universe works?
Exactly. Then there's the affective category, which involves the profound emotional shifts.
Like what kind of emotions?
Primarily this overwhelming sense of peace and joy.
Okay. And paranormal. Because I feel like that word usually makes scientists run for the hills.
It does, usually. But in this clinical context, paranormal just refers to things like out-of-body experiences or having physical sensations that defy normal biological explanation.
Like having super acute hearing or vision while you're completely unconscious.
Right. And finally, the transcendental category. This covers encounters with mystical beings, deceased loved ones, or otherworldly environments.
Okay, I want to try and put myself in the shoes of someone going through this. Based on Grayson's scale and Moody's elements, can you walk us through what the prototypical sequence feels like?
Sure.
Because I know not everyone experiences every single element, but there seems to be an ideal chronological path that the sources map out.
Yeah, let's trace that path. The sequence almost universally begins at the exact moment of maximum physical trauma.
So the moment of death.
Right. And the patient often reports a distinct moment where they actually hear themselves pronounced dead by a doctor or a nurse.
And that has to be so surreal.
It's a moment of sheer clinical finality. And then immediately following this, there's often a jarring auditory component.
Like a loud ringing.
Yes, a loud ringing, a buzzing, or sometimes this uncomfortable, almost mechanical roaring noise.
Okay, so they hear the doctor, then a loud buzz.
And simultaneous with that overwhelming sound, they feel a sensation of rapid movement. They describe being pulled or propelled at immense speed through a dark, enclosed space.
Oh, this is the origin of the famous dark tunnel concept.
That's the one.
Right, the tunnel. That's the one detail that has completely saturated the cultural zeitgeist. I mean, everyone knows about the tunnel of light.
But the tunnel is really just the transit mechanism. As they reach the end of it, the experience radically shifts again. This is where the out-of-body phase really begins.
Okay.
They typically find themselves completely detached from their physical form. They're looking down at their own body and the frantic resuscitation efforts from a vantage point up near the ceiling.
I can't even imagine the psychological shock of that.
Right.
Looking down at your own lifeless body while doctors are pounding on your chest. You'd think that would be absolutely terrifying.
Well, that's the paradox of the whole thing.
Yeah.
They almost universally report a feeling of profound detachment and immense peace.
Peace. Really?
Yes. The pain of whatever killed them is instantly gone. And from that vantage point near the ceiling, the environment shifts yet again. The clinical reality of the hospital room fades away, and they transition into this transcendent, brilliantly lit environment.
And this is where they meet people, right?
Exactly. Here, they often report being greeted by the spirits of deceased loved ones, family members or friends who have passed on before them. They kind of act as guides or a welcoming committee.
And then, according to the sources, the culmination of the entire sequence occurs. And this is where the story completely shifts gear for me.
You're talking about the being of light.
Yes. Because they don't just hang out with their deceased grandparents. They encounter something the literature refers to as the being of light. And I want to hit pause here because the interaction with this being is arguably the most staggering part of all the research.
It really is. It initiates what they call the life review.
The life review.
Yeah, the life review is routinely described by experiencers as the absolute zenith of the event. It's fundamentally transformative.
And it flies in the face of so much cultural expectation. I mean, if you ask the average person on the street what a life review at the end of their life would look like, they imagine a courtroom.
Right, exactly.
They imagine this terrifying judge on a high bench reading off a scroll of every terrible thing they've ever done.
Yeah.
But the sources are so incredibly specific that this is not what happens at all. The being of light doesn't ask condemning questions.
No, not at all. The interaction is entirely devoid of judgment or wrath. The being of light communicates, usually described as happening telepathically, without spoken word.
Just mind to mind.
Right, and it uses Socratic questioning. It asks profound, reflective questions. Things like, are you ready to die? And what have you done with your life to show me?
It's not asking for a list of sins. It's asking for a demonstration of purpose.
Exactly.
And the way the patients describe this review is just, man, it gave me absolute chills reading the executive summary. Because it isn't just like sitting in a theater watching a highlight reel of your life.
No, it's described as a full-color, fully immersive, 360-degree holographic panorama.
Which sounds like sci-fi, but that's how they describe it.
Yeah. Every single moment of their life, from birth to the moment of death, is presented simultaneously. Yet somehow, they are able to focus on specific, minute details with perfect clarity.
And the detail that stopped me in my tracks is the emotional component of this.
Yeah.
When they go through this review, they don't just watch themselves saying or doing things. They literally feel the emotions of the other people they interacted with.
That is the crucial mechanism of the life review. It forces this absolute, unavoidable empathy.
Let me just break that down for you listening because it's so important. If you were cruel to a cashier at a grocery store 10 years ago, you don't just watch yourself yelling at them.
Right.
You actually inhabit their consciousness for that moment. You feel the sting of your own words from their perspective. You feel their embarrassment, their ruined day.
It's intense.
But conversely, if you did something kind, even something you completely forgot about, like just smiling at a stranger,
yeah.
you feel the warmth and gratitude that bloomed in their chest because of your action. You are forced to experience the ripple effect of your entire existence through the emotional lens of everyone you ever touched.
Just imagine the psychological weight of that.
I can't.
The ego is entirely stripped away. You can no longer justify your bad behavior or downplay your good deeds because you are physically feeling the exact impact they had on others.
Wow.
And according to the experiencers, the being of light uses this panoramic, empathetic review to impart two ultimate universal lessons.
Okay, what are they?
First, that the highest purpose of human existence is the cultivation of unselfish love.
Unselfish love, okay.
And second, the continuous, unending quest for knowledge. The acquisition of wisdom and the sharing of compassion are literally the only currencies that matter in this space.
I can hear the skeptics right now, though.
Oh, I'm sure.
I can hear people listening to this and thinking, okay, this is a beautiful story, but the person was dying. Their brain was suffocating. They were just having an incredibly vivid, oxygen-deprived hallucination. It was just a dream.
That's the standard materialist response, yeah.
But when researchers propose that idea to the patients, they vehemently push back, don't they?
They completely reject the dream hypothesis. And they don't just reject it casually, they reject it with deep frustration.
Why are they so frustrated by it?
Because across the entire 40-year span of research, from Moody to Grayson, the most consistent descriptive theme is the absolute clarity of the event.
The phrase that popped up constantly in Dr. Grayson's paper is hyper-real. They say the NDE was more real than ordinary waking reality.
Right. Think about the nature of dreams for a second.
Okay.
Dreams are fragmented, they are illogical, they jump from one absurd scenario to another, and when you wake up, they immediately begin to fade, right? They leave you with this fuzzy, confused memory.
Yeah, usually within 5 minutes I've forgotten my drift.
Exactly. But the near-death experience possesses a lucidity, a structural logic, and a permanent vividness that stands in stark contrast to the confusion of a dream state or the delirium of a dying brain.
There is a quote from an experiencer in the Moody executive summary that I think perfectly illustrates how this hyper-reality just absolutely ruins their previous worldview.
I know the one you're talking about.
Yeah, this person came back from their NDE, recovered in the hospital, and upon returning to their normal life, realized that there is, and I'll quote it directly, more to life than Friday night movies and the football game.
That is a profound paradigm shift.
Right. Because suddenly, the mundane, everyday things that we completely obsess over, status, entertainment, trivial arguments, they are exposed as entirely meaningless. That experiencer dedicated the rest of their life to that continuous quest for love and knowledge they were taught during the review.
It changes everything for them.
But as a host trying to explain this, and as researchers trying to document it, we run into a massive roadblock, and that is the word ineffable.
The linguistic limitation. It is one of the most frustrating aspects for both the experiencer and the scientist.
It makes total sense if you think about it, though.
How so?
Well, our entire human language, every single word we have ever invented, is tethered to our physical senses. We have words for how things look, smell, taste, sound, and feel in a three-dimensional world governed by linear time.
Exactly.
So if consciousness is thrust into an environment that exists entirely outside of physical space and chronological time, how on earth do you describe it? You literally lack the vocabulary. It's like trying to describe the architecture of a fifth dimension using a three-dimensional dictionary.
That is a highly accurate way to frame it.
Okay.
The experiencers are essentially forced to use crude metaphors.
Like what?
They will say things like, it was like a light, or it was like a tunnel, but they will almost always add a caveat.
They know the words fall short.
Right. They'll say, it wasn't like a light bulb or the sun, it was a living light, or it wasn't a physical tunnel of brick, it was a funnel of energy. They know the words they are using are woefully inadequate to convey the reality they actually experienced.
Okay, so we've established the anatomy of the modern NDE. But reading the Cambridge University Press historical chapter, I realized my own massive blind spot here.
What was that?
Because modern CPR brought these experiences into bright, sterile 20th century hospital rooms, I subconsciously assumed this was a purely modern phenomenon. But the sources show that the echoes of antiquity are incredibly loud.
They are deafening, actually. I mean, ancient civilizations obviously didn't have defibrillators or intensive care units, but their historical and archaeological records show a profound, deeply ingrained understanding of death. And critically, they didn't view it as a cessation of existence. They viewed it as a transition.
And the physical evidence for this belief goes back way further than written language. The sources highlight archaeological findings in an ancient Turkish graveyard, specifically Neanderthal burial sites.
Yes, the Shanidar cave findings.
And the fascinating part isn't just that they buried their dead, it's how they buried them. They weren't just discarding bodies into the dirt. They were laying them to rest on biers woven from specific, brightly colored flowers.
Which is an astonishing detail.
It really is.
Because it implies that over 100,000 years ago, early hominids were engaging in complex funerary rituals. A bed of flowers suggests a celebration, or at least a reverent acknowledgement of a transition.
Like they knew something we forgot.
It points to a primal, deeply rooted intuition that the physical body is merely a vessel, and that the cessation of breath is not the end of consciousness.
And when we do finally cross the threshold into written history, the parallels between those ancient texts and Grayson's modern NDE scale are frankly staggering. I want to talk about Plato.
Ah, yes.
Because the Cambridge source dives into Plato's famous work, The Republic, which culminates in a story called The Myth of Can you explain who was and what he saw?
Yeah, the Myth of is a foundational text in Western philosophy. Was a soldier, a warrior from Pamphylia, who was killed in a massive battle.
Okay.
10 days after the battle, when they were collecting the bodies, they found his corpse. But remarkably, it hadn't decomposed at all.
That's weird.
Right. So 12 days after his death, they placed his body on a funeral pyre to burn him.
And just as they were about to light the fire, he wakes up. Which, by the way, is the ultimate dramatic wake-up call.
Truly. He spontaneously revives right on the pyre.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't just wake up confused. He wakes up with an incredibly complex, detailed narrative of what happened to his consciousness over those 12 days.
What did he say happened?
He describes leaving his physical body and traveling with a great company of souls to a mysterious region.
The transcendental environment.
Exactly. He describes encountering divine judges who reviewed the lives of the incoming souls.
Which is a clear parallel to the life review.
A direct parallel. He talks about seeing a pillar of light extending through the heavens and the earth and observing souls choosing their next lives based on the wisdom they had acquired.
What fascinates me is that Plato didn't just write this as a piece of speculative fiction or like a fun fantasy novel. He was using it to make a serious philosophical argument.
Yeah.
He took these stories of revenants, people who returned from the dead, really seriously.
He treated them as empirical evidence for the immortality of the soul and for the moral order of the universe.
Wow.
And this isn't isolated to ancient Greece either. If we look eastward, the Cambridge text examines the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which is also known as the Bardo Thodol.
Which is basically a field manual for dying. Right.
That's a perfect description of it. In Tibetan Buddhism, dying is not seen as a sudden, terrifying cliff that you just fall off. It is considered an artful skill that requires preparation.
I love that framing.
The Book of the Dead is designed to be read to the dying person and actually guide their consciousness through the bardo, which is the transitional state between death and rebirth.
The phenomena described in that text are identical to modern NDEs, aren't they?
Remarkably so. The text prepares the dying person to experience a separation from the physical body, to encounter blindingly bright, pure light, and to be faced with various peaceful and wrathful deities.
Wait, wrathful deities?
Well, the text explicitly warns the dying person not to be terrified by the loud, roaring sounds they will hear.
The buzzing Moody talked about.
Exactly. And it tells them to recognize that the entities they encounter are just projections of their own mind and past actions. It is literally an ancient map of the exact sequence Moody and Grayson documented in 20th century hospitals.
That is so cool. We also see echoes of this in Western religious texts, right? The Old Testament has prophets like Isaiah and Daniel comparing death to a deep sleep from which one eventually awakens.
Yes, the parallels are everywhere.
And then, jumping much further forward to the 18th century, the sources bring up Emanuel Swedenborg.
Swedenborg is a really fascinating historical case study.
Who was he?
He was a brilliant, highly respected natural scientist and philosopher in the 1700s. He studied anatomy, physics, chemistry. But in his mid-50s, he underwent a profound spiritual crisis.
Okay.
And he began experiencing what he described as direct, open communication with the spiritual realm.
And what's wild to me is that he wrote extensively about the mechanics of dying.
Yeah.
His descriptions of passing from the physical world to the spiritual one, the process of separating from the corporeal body, and his encounters with spiritual entities who guide the newly deceased.
Yes.
It reads like a transcript from one of Raymond Moody's interviews 200 years before Moody even went to medical school.
It really does. However, the academic sources we are reviewing raise a very crucial point of analysis right here.
What's that?
While the core features of the experience across history are remarkably consistent, culture acts as a massive, unavoidable lens for how the experience is interpreted and ultimately reported.
Right. So if the core code of the experience is invariant, why does a Christian farmer in Ohio see Jesus, while a Hindu patient in New Delhi sees Yamaraj, the god of death?
That is the exact question anthropologists and psychiatrists ask. The prevailing theory is that the raw data of the experience, the feeling of absolute peace, the sensation of leaving the body, the encounter with an overwhelming presence of light and love, that raw data is universal.
Okay.
But the human brain, upon returning to the physical body and trying to process this totally ineffable event, reaches into its own cultural lexicon to label it.
I was actually trying to think of an analogy for this while reading the Cambridge chapter.
Let's hear it.
It's almost like downloading the exact same software program but running it on different operating systems.
I like where this is going.
So the foundational code of the software is identical, but the user interface, the icons, the colors, the windows, changes completely based on whether you are running it on a Mac, a PC, or Linux. The operating system is the person's cultural background.
That is a highly functional analogy. The being of light is the raw software code. The Christian brain interprets that code and renders the interface as Christ. The Jewish brain renders it as an archangel.
And a secular person.
A secular person might simply render it as an embodiment of pure, intelligent energy. The fundamental reality of the encounter is the same, but the cognitive packaging is culturally dependent.
And it isn't just the entities they meet, right? The actual architectural details of the environment change too. One of the most surprising facts in the sources is about the tunnel. We think of the tunnel as universal, but it's not.
No, it is predominantly reported in Western cultures. When researchers interview indigenous populations, Native American tribes, Aboriginal Australians, or Pacific Islanders, they very rarely report the sensation of the tunnel.
Which is wild. So what do they see instead?
They report the transition, they report the rapid movement, and they report encountering spiritual beings. But the architectural framework of a tunnel isn't how their brain processes the transit.
So what is the framework?
They might describe crossing a river, climbing a massive tree, or walking a long, desolate road. It highlights that the NDE is a profoundly real human experience, but our brains have to work overtime to categorize it using the symbols we grew up with.
So if we accept that culture acts as a filter for this experience, that the brain is frantically trying to dress up a terrifying, unexplainable event in familiar clothes, the immediate question any skeptic or any doctor is going to ask is pretty obvious.
Right?
Isn't that absolute proof that this is just a dying brain hallucinating based on its own memories?
And that exact question is what triggered the great scientific debate over the last 40 years.
Let's get right into the crosshairs of modern science then, because the medical community didn't just hear Moody's stories and say, cool, there's a beautiful afterlife, case closed.
Definitely not.
They did what scientists are supposed to do. They rigorously tried to find the biological mechanism responsible for the illusion.
For decades, there have been mechanistic reductionist attempts to explain NDEs purely through physiological and psychological models. The goal was to prove that the NDE is simply the byproduct of a malfunctioning organ.
But reading through Dr. Grayson's paper, it's fascinating to see how the empirical data collected in ICUs actually contradicts almost all of these standard biological theories.
It does. Let's systematically dismantle a few of them, starting with the most common one.
Okay, let's do it.
If you stop breathing, your brain lacks oxygen. This is the hypoxia or carbon dioxide theory.
Which seems like the most intuitive assumption, right?
Absolutely. The hypothesis dictates that as the heart stops, the brain is deprived of oxygen, which is called hypoxia, or it becomes overwhelmed by a toxic buildup of carbon dioxide hypercarbia.
Okay.
And this chemical imbalance causes the brain to misfire, resulting in elaborate hallucinations.
It sounds perfectly logical on paper. I mean, if I hold my breath long enough, my brain goes haywire.
But the clinical reality of hypoxia in a hospital setting is vastly different from an NDE. Any doctor who works in an intensive care unit will tell you that when a patient is suffocating or experiencing severe oxygen deprivation, their mental state does not become clear and peaceful.
What happened?
They become deeply agitated, belligerent, paranoid, and highly confused.
They are thrashing around. They aren't floating peacefully near the ceiling, having a highly organized chronological life review.
Precisely. The psychological distress of clinical hypoxia is the polar opposite of the crystal clear, serene narratives of a near-death experience.
That makes total sense.
Furthermore, and this is where the empirical data really crushes the theory, studies have been conducted where doctors actually tested the blood gas levels of patients during cardiac arrests.
Oh, wow. They actually tested it in the moment.
Yes. They compared the oxygen and CO2 levels of patients who reported NDEs against those who did not.
And if the theory was right, the NDE patients should have rock-bottom oxygen levels.
But they didn't. In fact, patients who reported NDEs often had higher or perfectly normal blood oxygen levels compared to the patients who experienced nothing.
Wait, higher?
Yes. There is zero clinical data showing that decreased oxygen specifically triggers the profound, highly structured experience of an NDE.
Okay, well that knocks out hypoxia completely.
Yeah.
What about the psychological theories? I have to admit, when I was reading the source material about the tunnel of light, my immediate thought went to Carl Sagan.
Ah, yes, the birth memory theory.
Yeah, I remember reading his work where he proposed that this entire phenomenon is just a repressed memory.
Sagan proposed that the famous tunnel of light is actually the dying brain reaching back to its very first traumatic experience, which is passing through the birth canal and emerging into the bright light of the delivery room.
It's an incredibly poetic idea, honestly. The end of life mirroring the beginning of life. But Dr. Grayson's paper completely dismantles it on a biological level. Why does the birth memory theory fall apart?
Because it completely ignores the neurological reality of a newborn infant. A newborn's brain is not a miniature adult brain. It is vastly underdeveloped. The neurological coding capacity, specifically the myelin sheaths that insulate neurons and allow for complex memory storage, is just not formed yet.
Wow.
Furthermore, their visual cortex is incredibly rudimentary.
So they literally lack the hardware to record a visual memory of being born.
Exactly. A newborn cannot focus its eyes, let alone record, store, and recall specific spatial and visual memories of moving down a dark tunnel toward a light. The brain simply doesn't have the capacity to retain that tape.
And there's a specific, undeniable data point in the sources regarding cesarean sections that I love discovering, because it is the ultimate fatal flaw for Sagan's theory.
The C-section data is definitive.
If the tunnel is a memory of the birth canal, then people who were born via C-section who literally never went through the birth canal should never report a tunnel NDE.
But the statistical data shows they do. People born via C-section report the exact same dark tunnels and rapid transit as people born vaginally.
So the birth method has zero effect.
Zero statistical correlation to the presence of a tunnel in an NDE.
Theory dismantled. Okay, so let's look at what they are pumping into the patients. The hallucination or drug theory. The assumption is that the heavy narcotics, anesthetics, or adrenaline given during resuscitation, or maybe the high fever of a dying body, induce these vivid visions.
Again, a completely logical assumption. But the clinical data says the exact opposite. Broad statistical studies show that pharmacological interventions in fever actually inhibit NDEs.
Wait, they stop them from happening?
Yes. Patients who are heavily medicated with pain drugs or who are running extreme fevers are actually less likely to report a near-death experience.
That seems backward.
And when they do hallucinate due to drugs, the nature of the hallucination is entirely different. Drug-induced hallucinations are highly clouded, confusing, and often frightening.
Like a bad trip.
Exactly. They usually involve bizarre, illogical interactions with living people or imaginary creatures. NDEs, by contrast, consistently feature clear, incredibly lucid encounters with deceased loved ones.
The quality of the vision is fundamentally different. Okay, well, let's tackle the brain zap theory. Because if it isn't drugs or oxygen, maybe it's just an electrical short circuit. The temporal lobe seizure theory.
Right. The temporal lobes are located on the sides of the brain, just behind the temples. They are highly involved in processing sensory, input, and memory.
Okay.
Neuroscientists know that if you artificially stimulate the temporal lobe, it can cause strange, disorienting sensations. So the theory proposes that a dying brain, in its final moments, misfires, causing a localized seizure in the temporal lobe, which creates the illusion of leaving the body.
But the sources point out a massive difference between what a temporal lobe seizure feels like and what an NDE feels like. Seizure patients report horrific, bizarre spatial distortions.
Yes, distortions of their own body.
Right, they feel like their legs are growing to massive elephantine sizes, or their body is twisting in impossible directions. And crucially, they view these terrifying illusions from inside their own body.
Correct. They remain localized. A seizure patient doesn't suddenly float up to the ceiling with perfect mental clarity, look down at themselves, and feel an overwhelming sense of cosmic peace.
But what about the rat studies? Because Dr. Grayson's paper directly addresses this. And I remember seeing the headlines a few years ago.
The rat surge study.
Yeah, every science blog posted an article titled something like, "Scientists finally explain near-death experiences. It's just a brain surge in rats."
The media often extrapolates wildly from very narrow data. The study in question found that when researchers induced cardiac arrest in laboratory rats, they detected a brief, transient surge of electrical activity in the rats' brains right before death.
And skeptics latched onto this.
Yes, claiming this surge was the brain generating the NDE.
But the devil is in the details, as always.
Exactly. First, that surge in the rat brain was a tiny infinitesimal fraction of normal waking electrical power. It was hardly a massive burst of cognitive function. Second, and most crucially, that surge was completely eliminated if the rat was placed under general anesthesia before the cardiac arrest.
Which is a huge problem for the theory, because human beings have NDEs while under heavy general anesthesia during surgery all the time.
Furthermore, continuous EEG monitoring of dying human patients in ICUs has never reliably detected this specific, highly organized electrical surge.
What happens in humans then?
In humans, brain activity simply decreases, becomes chaotic, and flatlines within 10 to 20 seconds of the heart stopping.
So the biological mechanistic models are really struggling to account for the data. But what really drives the stake through the heart of the "it's just a hallucination inside a dying brain" theory is a category of events researchers call veridical perceptions.
Veridical perceptions are the absolute gold standard of NDE research.
What are they exactly?
These are specific out-of-body observations made by the patient during the NDE that are later independently verified as completely accurate by third-party witnesses.
This is where my mind was completely blown. Because if an NDE is just a hallucination generated inside the dark confines of a dying skull, it is physically impossible for that patient to learn new, verifiable information about the physical world around them while their eyes are taped shut and their brain is flatlining.
Let's share some of the specific examples documented in the literature because they are incredibly difficult for materialist science to explain away.
Let's talk about the plaid
A
shoelaces.
classic case.
There is a documented case of a patient who was brought into the emergency room completely unconscious. They undergo cardiac arrest, their heart stops, and a massive resuscitation effort begins. The patient is clinically dead.
Right.
Later, after being revived, the patient describes leaving their body and floating above the trauma room. And to prove they were up there, they accurately describe the unique plaid shoelaces worn by one specific nurse.
Now, a skeptic might say, well, the patient saw the shoelaces when they were being wheeled in.
Right, that's what I would say.
But the clinical notes prove that was impossible. This specific nurse was not part of the regular intake team. She was drawn into the room from another department only after the frantic moments of resuscitation began, while the patient was already flatlining and unconscious.
So the patient accurately described the footwear of a stranger who was only in the room while they were clinically dead.
Yes. And an even more dramatic case is the one we started this deep dive with, the surgeon flapping his arms like a bird.
Right.
It is a landmark case in the literature. The patient underwent open heart surgery. They were under deep general anesthesia. Their chest was sawed open, and their heart was literally stopped and placed on a bypass machine.
So they are as biologically offline as a human can get.
Absolute biological suspension. And yet, the patient later reported leaving their body, looking down at the operating table, and seeing their primary surgeon flapping his arms.
If I wake up from surgery and tell my doctor I saw him doing a chicken dance, they're going to schedule me for a psychiatric evaluation immediately. I mean, it sounds like the absolute definition of an absurd, drug-induced dream hallucination.
It does, until the researchers actually interviewed the surgeon.
And what did they find?
It turns out this highly specialized surgeon had a unique, highly idiosyncratic habit. After scrubbing in and completely sterilizing his hands and arms, he would enter the operating room and use his elbows to point at various monitors and instruct his surgical team.
Using his elbows.
Yes. He would continuously flap his arms against his torso to avoid accidentally brushing his sterile gloves against unsterile equipment.
A patient who is chemically paralyzed,
Yeah.
knocked out on anesthesia, chest cracked open, heart completely stopped, accurately observes and remembers their surgeon doing a highly specific, bizarre physical movement to maintain sterility. You just cannot hallucinate that. You cannot guess that.
In a comprehensive academic review of 93 distinct reports of out-of-body perceptions during NDEs, researchers found that 80 of those observations were corroborated by an independent informant.
80 out of 93.
Yes, corroborated by a doctor, nurse, or family member. And of those corroborated reports, 92% were completely, totally accurate to the smallest detail. Only 1% was found to be entirely erroneous.
92% absolute accuracy while clinically dead.
That level of verifiable data is incredibly difficult to explain away as a dying brain randomly misfiring.
So what does this all mean? If it's not a lack of oxygen, if it's not Carl Sagan's birth memory, if it's not drugs, and if people are accurately seeing plaid shoelaces and flapping surgeons, how do we explain the absolute edge cases?
The outliers.
Yeah, because the standard NDE is paradigm shifting enough. But the sources highlight outliers that completely break the traditional mold.
Yes, to truly understand the scope of this, we have to look at the anomalies. The most challenging anomaly to the traditional medical paradigm is a phenomenon known as shared death experiences, or SDEs.
This absolutely ruined the dying brain theory for me.
How so?
Because in a shared death experience, the person having the profound spiritual journey isn't dying. They aren't sick. They aren't on drugs. They are completely healthy bystanders.
Exactly. They are doctors, nurses, hospice workers, or perfectly healthy relative sitting vigil at the bedside of someone who is actively dying.
And yet, as the patient passes away, These healthy bystanders co-experience the NDE alongside them.
They
They
do.
report the environment shifting. They report seeing a transparent, energetic replica of the dying person rise out of the physical body. Some even report leaving their own bodies and rising up to accompany their loved one partway toward the light.
They hear the transcendent music. They see the deceased relatives coming into the hospital room to greet the dying person.
There is a specific, incredibly powerful account documented in the Missouri Medicine Journal source we reviewed. The editor of the journal wrote an addendum describing an experience told to him by a friend of over 30 years.
A highly intelligent, completely secular, trustworthy individual.
And this happened when the friend was just a child, right?
Yes. When this friend was just 6 years old, perfectly healthy, they were present in the room when their great-grandmother passed away.
Okay.
And at the exact moment of death, this healthy 6-year-old child witnessed the distinct white mist rise up from the dying great-grandmother's body. The child watched this mist float to the corner of the ceiling, linger for a moment, and then exit through the ceiling.
A 6-year-old child has no cultural priming for that. They aren't suffering from hypoxia. They aren't on adrenaline. Yet they witnessed a physical, visual manifestation of the transition.
SDEs heavily imply that whatever the near-death experience is, it isn't strictly an internal hallucination confined to the neurochemistry of the dying person. It behaves like an objective event in the room that can occasionally bleed over into the consciousness of healthy people in the immediate vicinity.
And then we have the Peak and Darien cases.
Yeah.
Where does that name even come from?
It refers to a poem by John Keats. It's about the explorers standing on a peak in Darien, Panama, looking out at the vast, undiscovered Pacific Ocean for the first time.
Okay, so it represents seeing something entirely unexpected.
Exactly. In NDE research, a peak in Darien case occurs when the dying person encounters someone in their out-of-body state whom they did not know was dead.
So if the skeptical hallucination theory argues that you only see your deceased grandmother because your dying brain is desperately trying to comfort you with familiar comforting memories, the Peak and Darien cases totally torpedo that logic.
Exactly. You wouldn't hallucinate someone you firmly believe is alive and well in the land of the dead.
The story in this sources about this is like something out of a Victorian novel.
It really is.
A man is dying, his heart stops, and he has a deep NDE. He goes to the transcendent realm, and he is met by a man he doesn't recognize at all, a total stranger.
Right.
He eventually returns to his body, recovers, and describes this strange man to his family.
And his mother, upon hearing the physical description of this stranger, is forced to reveal a massive, deeply guarded family secret.
She confesses that he was actually born out of an extramarital affair. His biological father was not the man who raised him. His biological father was a man who was killed in World War II.
The mother then goes into a drawer and shows him a photograph of his biological father for the very first time in his entire life.
And the man immediately recognizes him. It was the exact stranger from his NDE. He met his biological father, a man he didn't even know existed, let alone knew was dead on the other side.
These cases are incredibly rare, but they provide profound indirect evidence that challenges the hallucination model. The patient is acquiring accurate information about the deceased status of an individual that they could not possibly have known through normal cognitive means.
But while we are looking at these variations and outliers, I noticed a part in Dr. Grayson's paper where the scientific community actually had to correct the historical record regarding a very specific sensitive group of NDEs.
Yes, those resulting from suicide attempts.
Right. It is vital to discuss this. When Raymond Moody first published Life After Life in 1975, he was breaking new ground, but he didn't have a massive statistical sample size. He made a hypothesis about suicide that turned out to be inaccurate.
In his initial work, he suggested that NDEs induced by suicide attempts were generally unpleasant, almost punishing.
Why did he think that?
He theorized that because life is a gift or a specific curriculum we are supposed to complete, throwing it away resulted in a distressing, negative afterlife experience.
But science must be willing to correct itself when better data emerges. Later researchers, specifically Zingrone, Alvarado, and Bush, conducted much more rigorous, wide-scale studies focusing exclusively on distressing NDEs and suicide-related NDEs.
And they proved Moody's initial assertion false.
They completely dismantled it. They found that NDEs resulting from suicide attempts are not statistically or consistently different from NDEs resulting from heart attacks, car accidents, or surgical complications.
They feature the same tunnel, the same light, and the same profound peace.
And conversely, they found that anyone can have a distressing or terrifying NDE regardless of how they came close to death. A totally healthy person who gets hit by lightning could have a terrifying experience, while a person who attempts suicide could have a beautiful one.
Exactly. The core finding is that the NDE is not a punitive experience dictated by the method of death. The universe, it seems, does not punish the deep psychological pain that leads to suicide.
I genuinely love that the field was able to self-correct and remove that stigma.
It's a very important correction.
But taking all of this together, the verifiable plaid shoelaces, the shared death experiences with the white mist, the Pekindarian fathers, my brain was spinning trying to figure out how to model this.
It's a lot to process.
If the biological brain isn't generating this immense, complex consciousness during an NDE, what exactly is the brain's job?
Think about the foundational assumption of modern materialist neuroscience. We assume, implicitly, that the brain produces consciousness,
Right.
in the same way that a generator produces electricity or the liver produces bile.
The logic is, no brain, no consciousness. You break the generator, the power goes out.
But quantum-influenced neuroscience is beginning to ask a radically different question. What if the brain isn't a generator at all? What if it operates more like an antenna?
Like a television set.
Let's explore that. How does the television analogy work in this context?
Okay, if I am sitting in my living room watching a television show, and I take a baseball bat and completely smash the TV, the screen shatters, the picture goes black, the sound stops.
Right.
To a purely materialist observer standing in my living room, the show is dead. It ceased to exist because the physical machine is broken.
That's the materialist view.
But you and I know that the invisible broadcast signal, the radio waves carrying the show, is still out there in the air, completely unaffected by my baseball bat. The TV wasn't creating the signal. It was just a transducer.
Exactly.
It was the physical hardware filtering and displaying the signal so my eyes could see it. What if the human brain is just a biological television set?
That is a phenomenal, highly accurate analogy for the non-local consciousness model. It suggests that the brain filters, limits, and steps down a much broader consciousness so that we can function in a three-dimensional world.
So when the brain flatlines, when the TV is smashed by cardiac arrest, consciousness isn't destroyed. It's just no longer constrained or filtered by the physical organ. It expands back into its true, unfiltered state.
Yes.
That explains the hyperreality. It explains why they say it feels more real than being alive. They are finally receiving the signal without the static of a physical brain.
Exactly. We spent the entire 20th century acting like classical Newtonian physics could completely explain the mind. But just as physics eventually had to embrace the bizarre realities of quantum mechanics to explain the universe, neuroscience is standing at the edge of a similar precipice.
The data is forcing the issue.
The data is forcing us to consider that consciousness may be a fundamental property of the universe, like gravity or electromagnetism, and the brain is merely the receiver.
Which brings us to the final, and to my mind, the most practically important section of our deep dive. The aftermath.
Yes, the long-term effects.
Because regardless of whether you think this is a quantum broadcast signal, an antenna, or just a wildly complex biological glitch we haven't solved yet, the psychological aftermath on the people who experience it is undeniable, permanent, and objectively measurable.
The long-lasting effects of having an NDE are arguably the most robust area of the research. These individuals undergo a complete radical paradigm shift in their value systems, and critically, they're psychologically evaluated as completely healthy.
Right, they don't come back shattered. They don't suffer from PTSD, from the trauma of dying, and they aren't disassociated from reality, and they aren't
They are
psychotic.
deeply grounded, but their entire operating system has been rewritten. And the most universal, profound change is the total, absolute evaporation of the fear of death.
They just don't fear it anymore.
They no longer fear it because they have empirically experienced it. To them, death is no longer a dark abyss of nothingness. It is simply a transition to a broader state of being.
But paradoxically, and this addresses our earlier point, this total lack of fear doesn't make them reckless, and it certainly doesn't make them suicidal.
Not at all. In fact, near-death experiencers hold a fierce, almost unshakable objection to suicide.
Because of what they learned during the life review. They realize the deep, profound purpose of physical life. Even the painful parts. They understand that they are here in this physical realm specifically to learn, to grow, and to love under the constraints of a physical body. Cutting that short is seen as abandoning the curriculum before the class is over.
Their daily practical behavior changes just as dramatically as their philosophy. They routinely abandon pursuits of fame, wealth, and social status.
Which makes sense.
To someone who has felt the universal empathy of the life review, Acquiring material wealth at the expense of others becomes entirely illogical.
They shift their careers. Corporate executives become teachers or hospice workers.
They shift their entire lives toward compassion, service to others, and a deep, revitalized connection to nature. They live intensely in the present moment, appreciating the smallest details of existence.
They stop caring about the Friday night movies and start caring about the stranger at the grocery store.
Yeah.
But here is the part of the research that gives me an immense amount of hope.
What's that?
Because I read all this and thought, well, that's great for them, but I don't really want to get hit by a bus and flatline just to become a more empathetic person.
I think most people would agree with you.
But the sociological impact actually extends to non-experiencers.
This is one of the most promising, actionable areas of the current research. Several long-term studies have been conducted on college students, specifically at Miami University of Ohio, the University of Connecticut, and Montana State University.
And to be clear, these are healthy young students in the prime of their lives. They haven't had heart attacks. They haven't had NDEs.
Exactly. These students simply enrolled in a standard semester-long academic course where they deeply studied near-death experiences. They read the clinical accounts, they looked at Dr. Grayson's data, they studied the life review.
And what happened to them?
At the end of the semester, extensive psychological evaluations showed that merely learning about NDEs in a clinical academic setting caused these students to exhibit significantly increased compassionate concern for others, higher intrinsic self-worth, and a measurable diminished fear of death compared to control groups.
That is staggering.
Yeah.
Just reading about the being of light and understanding the concept of the panoramic life review where you feel the pain you cause others,
Yeah.
it acted like a psychological intervention.
It did.
It literally rewired their empathy without them ever having to set foot in an ICU.
If we synthesize all of this, the history, the science, the aftermath, we realize something profound about our modern trajectory.
What's that?
As medical technology continues to advance, our CPR protocols, our artificial hearts, our resuscitation techniques are going to get better and better.
We are going to pull more and more people back over that line. Millions of people.
Yes, we are actively creating a massive, exponentially growing population of returnees. And these individuals are quietly infiltrating society, returning to their jobs, their families, and their communities, bringing with them these reinvigorated, deeply empathetic, non-materialistic worldviews. They are acting as a subtle, pervasive, transformative force within our culture.
Okay, let's take a breath and recap the sheer scope of the journey we've been on in this deep dive.
It's been a long one.
We started with Dr. Moody's 15 core elements and Dr. Grayson's clinical scale, mapping the journey from the dark tunnel to the profound empathy of the life review. We looked back in time, seeing how ancient Neanderthals, laying their dead on beds of flowers, points to a primal intuition of this transition, and how Plato's myth of mirrors modern ICU reports.
We critically examined the scientific attempts to explain this away, and we saw how the biological reductionist theories fail. We detailed why a newborn infant lacks the neurology to remember a birth tunnel, and why hypoxia causes chaotic agitation, not crystalline peace.
We looked at the absolute, undeniable reality of veridical perceptions. The unconscious patient who accurately saw the plaid shoelaces, and the clinically dead man who saw his surgeon flapping his arms like a bird to stay sterile.
The undeniable outliers.
We explored the anomalies, the shared death experiences where a healthy 6-year-old child sees a mist leave their great-grandmother, proving consciousness isn't locked in the dying brain. And finally, we saw the transformative power this experience has, not just on the people who flatline, but on college students who merely study the data.
Which leaves us with a profound implication for our future. This raises an important question, perhaps the most important societal question we can ask ourselves.
Lay it on us.
If the core invariant teaching of the near-death experience is that our ultimate human purpose is the pursuit of unselfish love and knowledge, and if we have empirical proof that simply learning about NDEs can physiologically and psychologically rewrite a young person's empathy, what would happen to our global society if we stopped treating death as a medical failure to be feared, and instead treated it as the ultimate universal masterclass on how to live?
Do we really need to flatline to wake up?
That is the ultimate challenge the data presents to us.
You know, at the start of this deep dive, we talked about that cardiac surgeon and the broken expectations of medical science, how we demand clean binary answers, alive or dead, generator on or generator off.
Right.
But after looking at all this evidence, I don't think the machine of medical science is broken at all. I just think we've been pointing our instruments at the wrong thing. We've been dissecting the television set, searching desperately for the broadcast signal in the wires. And the signal has been there all along, expanding outward, waiting for us to tune in.
Beautifully said.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to take these insights, look at the world around you, and examine your own life's purpose with fresh eyes today.